The Gulf of Mexico has always carried whispers of storms, riches, and secrets, but in 1974 it held a silence so heavy that families across Texas and Louisiana never recovered. An oil rig, standing tall against the horizon, went dark one night. Radios stopped crackling, machines ceased their hum, and the crew, dozens of fathers, brothers, and friends, vanished. The Coast Guard swept the waters. Helicopters cut through the salt air, yet no trace surfaced. No distress signal, no bodies, no explanations, only an empty platform drifting in the waves, as if time itself had abandoned it. That silence remains one of the Gulf's most haunting mysteries. If you want to follow this journey through forgotten histories and chilling truths, make sure to subscribe. These are stories not just about what happened, but about what still lingers, waiting to be uncovered. Ethan Cole grew up in Houma, Louisiana, where the air smells of shrimp boats, diesel, and brackish water. His father worked the rigs back in the day, coming home with calloused hands and stories that made young Ethan stare wide-eyed at the Gulf. Among them, none stuck deeper than the tale of the vanished platform. Ethan had asked, did they fall? Did a storm take them? His father's answer was a hard shake of the head and a muttered, no storm, no accident, just gone. Those words carved themselves into Ethan's memory, pushing him toward the sea as a man. Now in his mid-30s, Ethan had become a marine engineer and diver, someone who understood the bones of steel structures sunk into the ocean floor. He knew the Gulf's moods, the sudden squalls, the deceptive calms, the way currents could twist around legs like ropes. But the mystery of 1974 had always been more than water and metal. It was personal. He'd watched neighbors mourn husbands who never returned, women who sat at kitchen tables staring at photographs yellowing with time. He'd seen silence choke them when officials spoke of unresolved incidents. For Ethan, the question was no longer curiosity, it was a duty. Standing on a pier outside Galveston years later, he watched the horizon where rigs still dotted the water like skeleton towers. His reflection in the waves seemed smaller against them, yet inside, a determination burned. People had let the past fade, but he couldn't. If nobody tells the truth, he whispered, then the Gulf swallows everything. The story wasn't just about a rig. It was about people, about men who kissed their children goodnight and never came home, about families told to move on while their hearts never did. Ethan believed answers lay buried not in archives, but beneath the platform itself. Every creak of rusting steel, every bolt hidden under barnacles might hold a piece of what happened that night. And if no one else would search, he would. The Gulf was unpredictable, dangerous even for experts, but danger had never been enough to quiet Ethan's conviction. The silence left behind in 1974 demanded a voice, and he was ready to give it one. His journey toward the rig was only beginning, but already the past was rising like a storm he could no longer ignore. The horizon stretched, endless and heavy, yet Ethan felt it drawing him closer. Somewhere out there, beneath decades of waves and corrosion, waited the first clue to unravel a disappearance that had haunted generations. And he would not turn away. In the early 1970s, the Gulf of Mexico was alive with ambition. Offshore platforms rose like steel cities above the waves, symbols of America's push for energy independence during a turbulent decade. Texas and Louisiana thrived on the boom. Men packed their bags, kissed their families, and rowed supply boats out to the rigs, knowing they would spend weeks suspended between sea and sky. These structures demanded everything: strength, grit, endurance, but they promised good wages and the pride of fueling the nation. The platform that would later vanish into mystery was one of these giants. It stood more than 100 feet above the water, braced against the Gulf's winds and waves. Its crew was a patchwork of working-class men, former soldiers from Vietnam looking for steady pay, young fathers eager to build a future, veterans of the oil fields who knew the sound of drilling like a heartbeat. Their lives were simple yet hard, tied to both danger and camaraderie. Among them was Jack Miller, a wiry electrician from Beaumont with a laugh that carried across the deck. His brother Paul remembered him as the guy who could fix anything and still make you smile. There was David Collins, a father of 3 from Lafayette, who carried a photo of his kids tucked in his locker. And there was Robert Bobby Harris, a Navy veteran, who felt safer on steel above the waves than on dry land. These men, along with dozens more, formed the crew whose fate would leave generations in disbelief. The night of the disappearance was like any other, or so it seemed. Radios that usually buzzed with check-ins fell silent. A supply vessel scheduled for routine delivery approached the platform at dawn, only to find it deserted. The crane hung motionless. The drill floor was empty. Plates of food sat untouched in the galley, as though dinner had been abandoned mid-bite. Bunks were unmade, clothing scattered, yet there was no chaos, no sign of a rush. It was as if the men had simply stood up and walked away into the night. The Coast Guard launched an immediate search. Helicopters combed the waters, their blades thundering over endless blue. Ships dragged sonar, hoping to detect wreckage. But the sea gave nothing. Families crowded into small-town offices, waiting for answers that never came. "We just need to know if they're alive," one mother pleaded, clutching a rosary in her hand. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, officials released a report. Unresolved incident. No foul play suspected. Yet those words rang hollow to those who had lost husbands, brothers, and sons. Rumors quickly filled the silence left by the investigation. Some whispered of sabotage, others of accidents hushed to protect oil profits. In the diners of Galveston, old men swore the government knew more than they admitted. In Baton Rouge, a widow insisted her husband had warned her of strange construction beneath the rig before he left. But without evidence, all that remained was speculation. What lingered most was the absence. The Gulf had swallowed men before, through storms, explosions, or simple bad luck. But this disappearance carried no storm, no wreckage, no explanation. It was emptiness carved into history, an event that refused closure. The platform itself became a ghost on the horizon, shunned by workers who believed it cursed. And so the mystery hardened over time, becoming part of Gulf Coast lore. Families moved on, at least outwardly, but photographs stayed framed on mantels, and questions lingered in kitchens and back porches. 30 years would pass before anyone dared to search deeper, but the silence of 1974 never truly faded. It lived on in the waves, in the rusting steel, and in the unhealed grief of those left behind. Ethan Cole had always carried the story of the vanished rig like a weight in his chest. His earliest memory of it was sitting at his father's kitchen table, the smell of crawfish boiling outside, when the older man leaned back in his chair and spoke with a grave tone. "Son, some things the Gulf doesn't give back." That rig was one of them. Those words lodged deep, but as Ethan grew older, they became less a warning and more a challenge. By his 30s, Ethan was a respected marine engineer and diver, someone who understood how structures survived or failed against salt, pressure, and time. Yet no matter how many jobs he took in Houston or New Orleans, the mystery of 1974 followed him like a shadow. He often found himself staring at old photographs, faded news clippings, and weathered reports, searching for what wasn't written. He wasn't chasing ghosts, he was chasing answers. The family's grief haunted him. He had neighbors who lost relatives on the platform, and he'd seen the way silence broke them more than truth ever could. He remembered one widow, Mrs. Collins, who had sat on her porch for years, eyes on the horizon. "If I just knew what happened," she told him once, her voice trembling, "I could rest." That plea had stayed with him long after, but deciding to dig deeper wasn't easy. He knew that oil companies guarded their history fiercely. Bureaucracy could smother any attempt at investigation, and most people didn't want old wounds reopened. Friends told him to leave it alone. "Ethan, it's been 30 years, Marcus, an old diving partner, warned him. "If the Coast Guard couldn't find the truth, what makes you think you can?" Ethan only shook his head. "Because I won't stop at what's convenient." Inside, he wrestled with fear. The Gulf was merciless. One mistake underwater could mean death, and chasing a 3-decade-old mystery might ruin his reputation. Still, he felt something stronger than fear, a sense of duty. He wasn't just diving for himself, he was diving for those who never came back, and for those still waiting. His father's old stories gave him fragments of possibility, Rumors of unauthorized modifications beneath the platform, whispers of sealed areas never reported in blueprints. The more Ethan thought about it, the more he believed the answers weren't buried in paperwork, but in steel and salt below the surface. That belief became an obsession. On a late night in Houston, staring at spread-out documents across his desk, Ethan whispered to himself, "This isn't about proving a legend, it's about giving those men their names back." His determination hardened like concrete. He knew he couldn't do it alone. The journey ahead would demand allies' expertise and courage beyond his own, but he was ready to take the first step no matter the cost. The Gulf's horizon stretched endlessly in his mind, calling him back to where it all began. The silence of 1974 demanded an answer, and Ethan was prepared to dive into it, even if it consumed him. For the first time, he felt that the mystery wasn't just a story from the past, it was his calling. Ethan knew he couldn't confront the mystery of the vanished rig on his own. The Gulf was too vast, the risks too high, and the forces that might resist his search too powerful. He began calling people he trusted, those who shared both the skill and the grit needed for a journey into shadows. The first was Marcus Reed, a seasoned diver out of Houston. Marcus had a reputation for pushing limits, but also for saving lives when dives went wrong. Ethan remembered the day Marcus hauled a panicked rookie out of a rip current, dragging him back with lungs burning. They had worked side by side for years, and their friendship carried a mix of trust and banter, born only of shared danger. When Ethan told him about the rig, Marcus laughed at first. "Man, you really want to dig up that old ghost story?" Ethan's reply was steady. "It's more than a story. You know it." After a long pause, Marcus sighed. "All right, if you're going under, I'm not letting you drown alone." Next came Dr. Laura Bennett, a maritime historian teaching at Tulane University. She wasn't a diver, but her mind was sharper than any blade. She had spent years tracing the Gulf's industrial history, piecing together the rise and fall of platforms, shipwrecks, and forgotten projects. Ethan approached her in her office, walls lined with maps and photographs of rusting structures swallowed by the sea. "I need the truth, not myths," he told her. Laura studied him with cautious eyes before answering. "Truth is expensive. It costs careers, reputations, sometimes more. But if you're serious, I'll help you separate fact from folklore." Finally, Ethan sought out Captain Jim Delgado, a grizzled boat captain who had worked supply runs in the Gulf since the 70s. Jim was practical, cautious, and stubborn as the tides. He had ferried crews through storms that would have broken lesser men, and his vessel, the Mariner's Pride, was as much a survivor as he was. When Ethan laid out his plan, Jim shook his head slowly. "Son, that rig is bad water. Folks say it eats men alive." Ethan leaned forward. "Or maybe folks just stopped asking the right questions." Jim studied him in silence, then spat into the Gulf. "If you're set on this, you'll need a steady hand at the helm. I'll take you there, but don't expect me to like it." The team was far from harmonious. Marcus's reckless humor grated against Laura's dry precision, and Jim's blunt caution clashed with Ethan's relentless drive. Yet beneath their differences lay a shared thread. Each of them had lost something to the Gulf, whether friends, time, or faith. Together, they formed a fragile alliance, bound not by trust alone, but by the weight of unanswered questions. As Ethan looked at the group he had gathered, he felt a flicker of both hope and unease. The search was no longer his alone. Each of them carried their own reasons, their own doubts, their own ghosts, and soon those ghosts would be tested in the depths of the Gulf, where silence had ruled for 30 years. The morning sun burned across the Gulf, turning the waves into sheets of copper. Ethan stood at the rail of the Mariner's Pride, his wetsuit half-zipped, eyes fixed on the rusted silhouette of the platform rising in the distance. The structure looked like a skeleton, corroded steel jutting against the sky, barnacles and seaweed clinging to its legs. It was a relic of another time, yet it carried the weight of everything that had been lost there. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder, mask dangling from his hand. "Still think this is a good idea?" he asked with a grin that barely hid his nerves. Ethan's jaw tightened. "It's the only idea." Laura stood nearby, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes despite the salt wind tugging at her papers. Jim Delgado muttered at the wheelhouse, "Fools chasing ghosts," but he kept the vessel steady, his weathered eyes scanning the waters as though expecting trouble. When Ethan and Marcus dropped into the sea, the cold struck like knives, seeping past the neoprene. Their flashlights cut through the murk, beams trembling against columns of steel that vanished into the deep. The platform loomed above them, its underbelly dark and vast, covered in coral growth and swarms of fish that darted away from the diver's approach. Ethan's breathing echoed in his ears, steady but heavy. He reached out, running a gloved hand along a support beam slick with algae. It felt like touching history itself, untouched, waiting. Marcus's voice crackled through the comms. "She's in bad shape. Surprised she's still standing." Ethan replied, "That's what makes her dangerous." As they swam deeper, they found signs of age: collapsed ladders, cables twisted like vines, doors eaten by rust. But what caught Ethan's attention was something different. A sealed access point bolted shut in a way that didn't match the rest of the rig. The metal was thicker, newer than its surroundings, as though someone had reinforced it long after the platform was first built. He tapped it with his knuckles, the dull thud reverberating through the water. Marcus hovered beside him, eyes narrowing behind his mask. "That wasn't on any blueprint I've seen." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Because it wasn't meant to be." They circled the entry, beams of light crossing over patches of welding marks, rough and hurried, unlike the original construction. It was no accident. Someone had sealed this door on purpose. Suddenly, Ethan's light flickered. For a heartbeat, darkness swallowed him, the weight of the ocean pressing in like a vice. He banged the flashlight, breath quickening until the beam steadied again. Marcus chuckled nervously over the comms. "Don't scare me like that. I thought we were about to join the missing crew." Ethan ignored the joke, though his chest tightened with unease. Their oxygen gauges ticked down, and they knew they couldn't linger. But as Ethan traced the edge of the sealed hatch, he felt certainty settle inside him. This was no ordinary structure. Whatever lay beyond had been hidden deliberately, perhaps for 30 years. He pulled back, signaling Marcus to ascend. When they broke the surface, the Gulf wind hit them hard, and Jim hauled them aboard with a grunt. "Find your ghost stories?" he asked. Ethan stripped off his mask, chest heaving. "Not stories," he said firmly, eyes locked on the rig. "We found a door." The others fell silent, the words sinking heavier than the waves around them. The rig had offered its first secret, and Ethan knew it would not let go easily. The next dive came with tension heavy enough to cut. Ethan briefed the team, his voice low but firm. "That hatch isn't original. Someone built it later, and whatever they locked inside has been waiting 30 years. We open it." Laura frowned, clutching her notebook. "You don't know what's behind it. It could be unstable, even lethal." Ethan met her eyes. "Or it could be the truth. We won't know unless we try." Marcus adjusted his gear with a smirk. "Guess we're about to find out who welded better, the engineers or the secrets." Back in the water, the sea pressed colder, darker. Their lights glinted off the sealed hatch, barnacles clinging like armor. Marcus steadied the crowbar against the edge, straining against the corroded bolts. Metal groaned, bubbles rising as if the ocean itself protested. With a final wrench, the first bolt snapped loose, the sound echoing in Ethan's ears through the comms. One by one they pried them free until the hatch creaked open with a rush of murky water. Inside, their beams revealed a narrow passage sloping downward into the belly of the rig. The walls were coated with rust and slime, but here and there patches of steel looked cleaner, as if maintained far longer than the rest. They swam cautiously, fins stirring silt into swirling clouds. Ethan's chest tightened, each breath loud against the silence. It didn't feel like exploring a ruin. It felt like trespassing into someone's hidden room. At the chamber's end, they surfaced into a pocket of air, their heads breaking through into stale dampness. Their lights swept across the space, and what they found rooted them in silence. The chamber was larger than expected, carved into the platform's understructure with rough precision. Old bunks lined the walls, mattresses rotting but still shaped by bodies long gone. Rusted toolboxes lay scattered, a half-empty thermos sitting on a shelf, as if someone had left it only yesterday. Marcus pulled off his regulator, voice hoarse. This isn't right. People lived here. Ethan stepped carefully, boots echoing on the steel floor. He picked up a wrench streaked with corrosion, the initials JM faintly scratched into its handle, his stomach clenched. These weren't just tools. They were the personal belongings of the missing men. Laura's voice trembled as she examined a locker door. It looks like they stayed here after the disappearance. But why? And why beneath the platform? The air smelled of mildew and rust, heavy with the weight of years. Ethan's flashlight beam caught something on the wall. Scratches, words carved deep into the steel. We were left here. His throat tightened, the message raw with desperation. Marcus swore under his breath, stepping back as though the chamber itself had teeth. No way this was in the company records. They built this to hide something. Ethan didn't answer. His mind raced, torn between the relief of discovery and the dread of what it meant. The chamber wasn't an accident. It had been prepared, inhabited, and abandoned without explanation. The silence grew unbearable, filled only by the dripping of seawater. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. He forced his voice steady. We document everything, photos, notes, every detail. This chamber holds their story. But even as he spoke, unease clawed at him. The chamber felt alive with echoes of men who had never left, and the deeper they looked, the more certain Ethan became that this was only the beginning of what the rig had buried. The discovery of the chamber spread tension through the team like a crack in glass. Back on shore, Ethan and Laura tried to access old records, but everywhere they turned they found doors closing in their faces. A clerk at the parish office in Galveston shook her head, her tone clipped. Those files are sealed, company property. You'll need higher clearance. At the library, microfilm reels ended abruptly, as if entire months of reports had been quietly removed. The first real pushback came from the company itself. A letter arrived at Ethan's apartment in Houston, printed on official letterhead, warning him to cease all unauthorized exploration of the platform. Legal jargon filled the page, phrases like liability concerns and trespassing violations. Ethan slammed it down on the kitchen table. They know what's down there, he muttered. Laura, seated across from him, adjusted her glasses, her expression tense, which means they'll do everything they can to bury it again. Days later, two men in pressed suits intercepted Ethan outside his office building. One, tall and clean-cut, spoke with rehearsed politeness. Mr. Cole, the company appreciates your concern for history, but this matter is closed. For your safety, we strongly advise you to end your search. Ethan squared his shoulders, his voice sharp. Safety or silence? The man didn't flinch. Sometimes, those are the same thing. They walked away, leaving Ethan with anger simmering under his skin. On the Mariner's Pride, even Captain Jim noticed the shift. As they prepped for another trip, he leaned against the rail, chewing on a toothpick. You stir up suits in Houston, they'll bury you before you get another dive. Ethan stared at the horizon. Then we'll find another way. Jim shook his head. You're stubborn, son. Stubborn gets men killed. For Ethan, the resistance only sharpened his resolve. He thought of the message scratched into the chamber wall. We were left here. If the company was willing to threaten him decades later, then the truth was more dangerous than he imagined. But danger had never been enough to make him stop. Still, fear gnawed at him in quiet moments. Lying awake in his apartment, the city humming outside, he wondered what line he was crossing. He had no legal authority, no protection if things escalated. But then he saw the faces of the men from old photographs, their eyes caught mid-laughter, unaware of what fate awaited them. He heard the voice of Mrs. Collins again, trembling on her porch. If I just knew what happened. That memory silenced his doubts. Laura worked tirelessly beside him, chasing scraps of information through archives, piecing together anomalies in shipping manifests and maintenance logs. Marcus, though rattled by the company's threats, stood by Ethan's side. If they're trying this hard to shut you down, Marcus said, then whatever's down there is worth finding. The obstacles were real, paperwork locked away, waters restricted by Coast Guard zones, threats lurking in plain words. But so was Ethan's determination. The chamber beneath the rig had spoken once, it would speak again. And no wall of silence, no matter how fortified, was going to hold forever. Ethan knew they couldn't rely only on rusted steel and sealed files. The truth also lived in the voices of those who had waited, grieved, and never stopped asking. Together with Laura, he began visiting the families left behind, moving between small towns scattered along the Gulf Coast. Their first stop was Lafayette, where the Collins family still lived in the same modest house David Collins had left behind in 1974. His widow, Marianne, opened the door, her hair silver now, but her eyes still sharp with the weight of memory. She welcomed them into a living room filled with photographs, David in a work helmet, David fishing with his children, David grinning at a barbecue. Marianne's voice trembled as she poured coffee. They told us nothing, just that he was gone like the sea swallowed him whole. Ethan leaned forward, his tone gentle. We found evidence, a chamber under the rig. We think the men were there, after the disappearance. Her hand froze on the cup, tears brimming. All these years I prayed he didn't just vanish, that he left something behind. In Galveston they met Paul Miller, younger brother of Jack Miller, the wiry electrician remembered for his laugh. Paul was in his 60s now, weathered by time and disappointment. Sitting on his porch, he lit a cigarette with shaky hands. Jack called me before that last trip, said something strange was happening on that rig. Not equipment failure, something they were building beneath it. He told me if anything happens it won't be an accident. I thought he was just being dramatic. Now I wish I'd listened harder. His words struck Ethan like a hammer. The hidden chamber wasn't just rumor, it was anticipated. Laura documented every story, her notes filling page after page. Each family carried fragments of a larger puzzle, odd comments before departures, whispers of unusual shifts, men hinting at extra work that wasn't drilling. In Baton Rouge, a daughter recalled her father saying, "They're making us work double shifts, but not on the rigs above. Below, always below." Her voice cracked. I was only 9, but I remember. He was afraid. Not every meeting was hopeful. Some families had turned bitterness into armor. One man, whose brother disappeared, slammed the door after spitting the words, "The company bought silence then, and they'll buy it again now. You can't change anything." But even in anger, truth leaked out, resentment that confirmed the depth of betrayal. For Ethan, these encounters lit both fire and sorrow. Each face reminded him that this wasn't just a mystery to solve, it was justice long denied. Laura saw it too, her historian's detachment cracking as she listened to stories told through tears. They were ordinary men, she whispered one evening as they drove along the coastal highway. They deserved ordinary endings, not this. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. That's why we can't stop. Their silence isn't natural, it was forced. And if there's even one record, one trace that confirms what we've found, we owe it to them to bring it back. As the Gulf wind howled outside, the words of a widow in Port Arthur lingered in Ethan's mind. She had leaned close, her voice fragile but certain. They weren't lost. They were hidden. That single phrase settled into him like an anchor, pulling him deeper toward the truth waiting beneath the waves. The Gulf was restless when they returned to the rig. The wind whipped across the deck of the Mariner's Pride, and whitecaps slammed against the hull. Ethan scanned the horizon, jaw tight. "Conditions aren't ideal," Jim muttered, spitting into the sea. "So you push it too far, the Gulf will take her due." Ethan adjusted his gear anyway. "We don't have the luxury to wait. Every delay gives them time to erase more of the truth." Marcus strapped on his mask with forced bravado. "Guess we're testing how much she likes us today." Laura, watching from the rail, pressed her lips together. "Just come back. Both of you." Her words hung heavy, the kind of plea that made silence sharper. The dive began rough. Strong currents pulled at their bodies like invisible ropes, twisting them off course. The water churned with silt, blinding them to more than a few feet ahead. Ethan fought to steady his breathing, each inhale rasping through the regulator. Marcus's voice crackled over comms, strained. Feels like the ocean's trying to drag us under. Then in the gloom, Marcus's tether snagged. It wrapped around a jagged beam, pinning him as the current slammed harder. Panic burst in his voice. "I'm stuck! Ethan! I'm stuck!" Ethan's pulse spiked. He kicked hard against the surge, reaching Marcus as the man thrashed, eyes wide with fear. Ethan's knife flashed, soaring through the rope while the sea tried to tear them both away. At last the tether snapped free. Marcus gasped, chest heaving, but his mask stayed sealed. They clung to the structure until the current eased enough to move. Ethan's grip on Marcus's arm was iron. "Stay with me," he barked. Marcus forced a shaky laugh. Hell of a way to get your attention. But his eyes betrayed the scare, haunted in a way jokes couldn't hide. Pushing deeper, they found what they hadn't seen before. A shaft, descending vertically, its edges too clean to be natural corrosion. It was an elevator shaft hidden beneath the rig, extending into the dark like a throat into the earth. Ethan's light traced the steel walls, reinforced and deliberate. His chest tightened. This isn't just a chamber, it's a whole level. Marcus hovered beside him, still shaken. "You sure you want to go down there?" Ethan stared into the shaft, the blackness yawning below. "We don't have a choice, this is what they built." Their oxygen was running low, forcing them to mark the location and ascend. When they broke the surface, Jim's eyes narrowed at their shaken expressions. "What the hell did you find this time?" Ethan hauled himself onto the deck, pulling off his mask. His voice came out rough but steady. "A way down, something bigger than we imagined." The gulf roared around them, waves slamming the hull, but Ethan felt only the weight of the darkness they had uncovered. The chamber had been the first clue. The shaft was the second, and together they pointed to something hidden far deeper than anyone had ever admitted. The discovery of the shaft gnawed at Ethan through sleepless nights. He replayed the dive in his mind, the clean steel walls descending into blackness, the way the ocean seemed to guard its secret like a living thing. Onshore, Laura spread old maps and rig schematics across a table, tracing lines with her finger. "No official blueprint shows a shaft beneath the platform," she said, voice sharp with frustration. "It wasn't just hidden, it was erased." Ethan leaned over the papers, his eyes hard. "Which means someone built it off the books." And they didn't want anyone to know. When the team returned to the site, conditions were calmer but the unease was heavier. Marcus still carried the memory of nearly drowning, though he masked it with a crooked grin. "Guess we're about to see what's at the bottom of the rabbit hole," Jim Delgado grumbled from the helm. "More like a grave. Rigs don't get built like that." Not unless someone's got something to hide. Descending again, Ethan and Marcus followed the shaft deeper. The beam of Ethan's light finally struck a platform welded into place, leading to a reinforced doorway. Unlike the rusted steel above, this metal gleamed with a darker sheen, corroded less by salt and time. Ethan's hand brushed the surface, the cold vibrating through his glove. "This isn't standard rig construction," he whispered through comms. "This is military grade." Inside, the chamber expanded into a cavernous room filled with rusting equipment. Old consoles lined the walls, buttons and switches covered in algae but still intact. Piles of storage crates sat half open, their labels faded. Ethan pried one open and froze. Inside were instruments not used for drilling, gauges, pressure regulators, and unfamiliar devices stamped with serial codes. He turned one in his hands, frowning. "These aren't oil tools. These are experimental systems." Marcus drifted closer, squinting at a corroded panel. "What the hell were they running down here?" Ethan didn't answer. His chest tightened with the implications. During the Cold War, corporations and government agencies had blurred lines, experimenting in places the public would never see. The missing crew hadn't just worked an oil rig, they'd been part of something far larger and far darker. Laura's voice crackled through the radio from the surface, anxious but steady. "What do you see?" Ethan swallowed before replying. "Not drilling equipment. This looks like a lab, or a test site." Silence followed. Then Laura spoke softly, almost to herself. "That explains the secrecy, but it doesn't explain the men. Where did they go?" Ethan turned his light across the room and caught sight of a clipboard sealed in a plastic sleeve. remarkably preserved. The paper inside was water-stained, but fragments of words remained legible. Pressure chamber. Extended confinement. His throat tightened. Whatever had been tested here hadn't been machinery alone. It had involved people. Marcus's voice broke the silence, lower than usual. "Ethan, if this is what it looks like, we're standing in the middle of something we're not supposed to find." Ethan stared at the clipboard, the carved letters from the earlier chamber echoing in his mind. We were left here. The truth wasn't just hidden. It had been buried under layers of steel, salt, and silence. When they surfaced, the Gulf air felt heavier, the horizon endless and oppressive. Ethan climbed aboard, water streaming from his gear. Jim studied his face, searching for an answer. "Well?" he asked. Ethan met his eyes, his voice low, steady, and grim. They weren't drilling for oil. They were drilling for something else. The words hung in the salty air, heavier than the storm clouds gathering in the distance. Whatever they had found wasn't just a secret chamber. It was the shadow of an experiment that had demanded silence at any cost. The revelations from the hidden level weighed heavily on the team. That night aboard the Mariner's Pride, the cabin felt colder, the hum of the generator rattling like a heartbeat no one could calm. Marcus sat hunched at the table, staring at his hands. His usual grin was gone, replaced by eyes clouded with exhaustion. "I almost died down there last time," he muttered, voice breaking the silence. "Now we're chasing ghosts and experiments that could have killed an entire crew. Maybe we're next." Ethan leaned forward, jaw tight. "We can't stop now. You saw what was down there, equipment that had nothing to do with oil. Men were trapped in that chamber, Marcus. They were used, not lost." Marcus slammed his fist against the wood, startling Laura. "And what if we end up like them? Left behind, forgotten?" His voice cracked under the weight of fear he could no longer disguise. Laura tried to steady the storm. "You're both right," she said quietly. "We've uncovered enough to prove something happened here, but pushing further could destroy us. History is filled with truths silenced by power. Maybe that's why no one ever told these families the real story." She adjusted her glasses, her composure masking the tremor in her hands. "We need to decide what we're willing to risk." Captain Jim stood near the doorway, arms crossed, his presence looming like a shadow. "I've seen men break chasing answers that don't want to be found," he said, voice gravelly. "That rig is cursed. The company doesn't want you near it, the Gulf doesn't want you near it, and hell, maybe God doesn't either. You're dragging all of us into a grave." Ethan rose to his feet, the weight of leadership pressing against him harder than the ocean ever had. He looked at Marcus first, then Jim, then Laura. "You think I don't know the risks? Every dive, I feel it in my chest. The current waiting to drag me under, the pressure crushing in. But this isn't just about me. It's about men whose names were erased, families who've waited decades for closure. If we walk away now, we're no better than the ones who locked that hatch." Silence stretched. Marcus avoided his eyes, chest rising with uneven breaths. Finally, he muttered, "You've saved my life more than once, Ethan. I'll follow you. But if the sea wants us, I'm not fighting her again." Laura exhaled, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "Then we document everything carefully. If the worst happens, someone has to know where to look." She turned her gaze on Ethan. "You lead, but don't forget, we can't afford mistakes." Jim shook his head, grumbling, "Damn fools. You're walking into something you don't understand." But he didn't leave. His hand rested on the wheel of the ship, knuckles white. Ethan caught the gesture and knew, despite the captain's warnings, he wasn't abandoning them. The fractures in the group were clear. Trust strained under the weight of secrets and fear. Yet in that fragile moment, something bound them tighter than before. They weren't just a team. They were witnesses to a truth too heavy for silence. And no matter how deep it was buried, Ethan felt the pull to dive again. The morning after their tense argument, the team awoke to unease carried by the Gulf wind. Jim was the first to notice the irregular hum of the engine. His eyes narrowed as he crouched near the stern, examining the equipment. "Something's off," he muttered. Ethan joined him, the salty air sharp in his lungs. Loose wires dangled where none had been before. A coupling had been tampered with, its edges marked by fresh scratches. Jim straightened slowly, his face grim. Somebody's been here. Marcus appeared, rubbing his eyes, and froze when he saw the damage. You're saying someone boarded us? Out here? His voice cracked between disbelief and fear. Laura, pale, clutched her notebook to her chest. Then it isn't just warnings. They're watching us. And they want us gone. They scrambled to inspect the vessel. A diving tank had been sabotaged. The regulator loosened just enough to fail under pressure. Ethan's stomach twisted at the thought of what could have happened below the surface. He held the tank up, voice hard. This wasn't an accident. If I'd taken this down, I wouldn't be here right now. Marcus swore under his breath, shaking his head. They're not playing around anymore. We're being hunted. The realization carved a heavy silence between them. Laura whispered, if they know we found the chamber, they'll do anything to stop us from going back. Maybe they already know too much. Ethan met her gaze, his expression carved from stone. Then we're closer than we thought. You don't try to silence people unless they're getting near the truth. Jim's voice cut through the tension, rough as gravel. Listen to yourselves. You're out in the middle of the Gulf with no backup, no protection, and now someone's messing with your air supply. You keep pushing, you won't live to tell anyone what you found. But Ethan's resolve burned hotter under the pressure. He slammed the regulator onto the table, the sound echoing in the cramped cabin. That's exactly why we have to keep going. The crew in 74 didn't have a choice. We do. We're not letting them erase this again. His eyes swept across Marcus, Laura, and Jim. We stay alert. We double-check every piece of equipment, but we don't turn back. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. You're insane. But fine. If we're going down together. Laura nodded, her fear shifting into determination. Then we document everything twice. If they silence us, the truth still survives. Jim shook his head, muttering curses under his breath, but he didn't walk away. His hands gripped the wheel tighter, the veins standing out on his weathered skin. He might have called them fools, but deep down, he was already committed. That night, as the waves slapped against the hull, Ethan stood on deck staring at the horizon. The Gulf was vast and empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from the dark. Whoever had touched their vessel hadn't finished the job, and next time they might not just tamper with equipment, they might try to take lives. The sabotage had turned the mystery into something far more dangerous. Now the question wasn't just what secrets the rig held. It was how far powerful men were willing to go to keep them buried. The next descent carried a weight that pressed heavier than the sea itself. Ethan checked every tank, every valve, every strap twice before stepping off the boat. Marcus followed with a forced grin, muttering, "If I don't make it back, tell Houston I owed rent." Ethan shot him a look through the mask, the kind that said there would be no jokes if they didn't both return. The shaft yawned before them, darker than ever, and together they descended until the steel walls gave way to a sprawling chamber. Their light swept across the interior, revealing details they hadn't caught before. Dustless patches marked where crates had been stacked higher once, and faint outlines of removed equipment lingered on the floor. Yet not everything had been taken. In the corner, sealed inside a watertight box, Ethan found objects that turned his blood cold. It was a collection of personal belongings. Dog tags, watches, faded wallets, even letters sealed in plastic. He pulled one free, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Through the blur of water stains, words etched decades ago came alive. They told us this was temporary, said we'd be home soon, but the doors are locked and the air feels thinner every day. If anyone ever finds this, tell Marianne I didn't stop fighting. The name scrawled at the bottom was David Collins. Ethan's throat closed. He pictured Marianne, silver-haired and grieving, clutching the photograph of her husband. Now he held proof that David hadn't just disappeared. He had been trapped, aware, and abandoned. He handed the letter to Marcus, whose usual humor vanished. Jesus, they knew, they all knew. Another letter bore the words of Jack Miller. They made us test the chambers. Hours inside, pressure climbing, lights going dark. Some didn't come back out. We begged to stop. They said it was for the country, for progress. But we were nothing but bodies to them. The scratches at the bottom looked rushed, desperate, as if carved moments before the end. Laura's voice came over the comms, trembling. "What did you find?" Ethan steadied his breathing before answering. "Proof. Journals. Letters. They weren't lost to the sea. They were sacrificed." Marcus rifled through the box, pulling out a watch still ticking faintly, preserved against all odds. His voice cracked. 30 years and this thing kept time. Better than the men it belonged to. He slipped it back with shaking hands. Ethan scanned the walls again and caught something scratched deeper into the steel. Unlike the earlier desperate message, this one carried calculation. Not an accident. Ordered. His stomach churned. It wasn't just neglect, it had been deliberate. Back on the surface, when they spread the letters across the cabin table, silence engulfed the group. Laura wiped tears she didn't try to hide. Jim stared at the papers like they were weapons. "This ain't just history," he muttered. "It's a crime scene." Ethan clenched his fists. The chamber had given up its dead men's voices, and now the team carried them into the light. But with that truth came an even sharper danger, the knowledge that someone had built a tomb beneath the gulf and walked away. And someone, somewhere, still wanted it forgotten. The weight of the letters hung heavy as the team sat in silence aboard the Mariner's Pride. The gulf rocked the vessel gently, a stark contrast to the storm inside their thoughts. Ethan spread the papers across the table once more, his hand lingering on David Collins's final words. "This is it," he said quietly. "This proves everything." Laura's eyes burned behind her glasses. "If we release this, it won't just be history. It'll be exposure. The company, the government, they won't let it stand." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of an approaching motor cut through the air. Jim was on deck in seconds, his voice sharp. "We've got company." A sleek white vessel was cutting fast across the waves, flying no flag. Ethan's pulse quickened as two men in dark jackets stepped aboard without invitation. The taller one spoke first, his tone clipped, rehearsed. "Mr. Cole, you've wandered into territory you don't understand. For your own good and for the safety of your team, you need to stop." Marcus stood, fists clenched. "Safety? You sabotaged our tanks. You call that safety?" The man didn't flinch. "You were warned. What happens from here is your choice." Ethan rose slowly, his voice firm despite the pounding of his heart. These men wrote their last words in steel and ink. They were locked beneath that platform, experimented on, abandoned. You want us to stop because you're afraid of the truth. The shorter agent's jaw tightened. Truth is irrelevant if no one lives to tell it. His words landed like a threat sharpened by years of silence. Laura slammed her palm against the table, anger breaking her usual composure. "You can threaten us, but these letters exist. We've copied them, documented them. Even if you sink this boat, you can't erase all of it." The taller man's eyes flicked toward Ethan, a mix of irritation and calculation. "You're playing a dangerous game. Careers, reputations, lives, they all vanish when you dig too deep." Ethan stepped forward, the Gulf wind whipping around him. So did those men in 1974. And we're not letting them vanish again. For a tense moment, the two sides stared each other down, silence thicker than the humid air. Then, without another word, the visitors retreated to their vessel and sped away, leaving only churned waves in their wake. Marcus exhaled shakily. "They'll be back. They don't make threats like that just to walk away." Jim's voice was gravel as he gripped the wheel. "You've lit a fire under giants. Once you do that, you'd better be ready to burn with it." Ethan gathered the letters, his hands trembling not from fear, but from clarity. The confrontation had confirmed what he already knew. The truth was dangerous, but it was undeniable. He looked at each of them in turn. Marcus pale and shaken, Laura fierce and resolute, Jim bitter but loyal. "We can't back down now," Ethan said. "Not when we hold their voices in our hands. This isn't just our fight, it's theirs." The gulf rolled beneath them, endless and dark, as if holding the memory of the men still waiting to be heard. The choice was made. They would not be silenced. The decision to reveal the truth carried no hesitation once it was made. Ethan returned to Houston with Laura and Marcus, their backpacks heavy with copied letters, journals, and photographs. Jim stayed with his vessel, muttering that ships were safer than city politics, but Ethan knew the old captain had given his blessing in his own quiet way. In Houston, Ethan prepared a dossier that pieced together everything: the chamber, the shaft, the experimental equipment, the sabotage, and most importantly, the words of the men who had vanished in 1974. Laura polished the language until it read like both history and indictment. Marcus, though still shaken, insisted on speaking to families personally before the story went public. "They deserve to hear it first," he said, voice steady. When they gathered the surviving relatives in a community hall in Galveston, the air was thick with grief and anticipation. Ethan stood before them, holding David Collins's letter. His voice trembled as he read, "If anyone ever finds this, tell Marianne I didn't stop fighting." Marianne, seated in the front row, covered her face and wept. For the first time in 3 decades, she had more than silence. She had her husband's last words. The truth spread quickly. Journalists latched onto the story, historians validated the evidence, and families demanded justice. The oil company issued flat denials, but the documents spoke louder than press releases. News outlets carried headlines of the forgotten rig crew and secrets buried beneath the Gulf. The silence of 1974 had finally been broken. But exposing the truth came at a cost. Ethan knew the powerful men behind the project would never face the consequences they deserved. The experiments had been sanctioned in shadows, buried under bureaucratic layers too thick to penetrate. Yet for the families, the truth itself was enough. Closure didn't erase grief, but it gave it form. No longer an endless void, but a story with an ending, however bitter. One evening, after the storm of interviews and reports, Ethan stood again on the Galveston pier where it had all begun. Marcus joined him, leaning against the railing, the Gulf breeze tugging at his shirt. "So was it worth nearly dying 3 times?" he asked, half serious. Ethan smiled faintly. "For them? Always." Laura walked up behind them, holding her ever-present notebook. "History owes itself to those who refuse to stay quiet," she said softly. "You gave these men back their voices." Ethan gazed out at the endless horizon, the rig barely visible in the distance, its rusted frame silhouetted against the setting sun. He whispered, almost to himself, "They were left there, but not anymore." The Gulf still rolled with secrets, but this one had surfaced. And with it, Ethan had transformed from a diver chasing curiosity into a man who carried the weight of justice for the forgotten. If you followed this journey, subscribe now to uncover more stories buried in silence. And don't stop here. Click on the video suggested on your screen to continue exploring the mysteries that history tried to hide. The sea still holds many voices, and their echoes are waiting.